There's this meme where right-wingers like Stefan Malamu say that our history is falsified and lied about by the leftist SJWs to try and control the future.
Hi everybody, this is Stefan Molyneux, and I hope you're as sick and tired as I am of being lied to about everything all the time, and I'm going to help you break out of the matrix of Marxist delusions that have birthed our self-destructive modern culture.
And it's incredibly frustrating when they say stuff like this because they're so close to enlightenment, and then they completely miss and fail miserably. It is true their history has been lied about, but it's not the leftists that are doing it. The US government has historically tried to silence any opposition to make themselves look good. This isn't clearer than an event nearly 50 years ago in 1962 known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. What's usually taught about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, the crisis took place from October 16, 1962 to the 28th. It started when the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba and the US felt threatened by this breach of security. The missiles were placed in Cuba because the US had placed missiles in Turkey. After multiple close calls, a quarantine, and an escalation of tension, the crisis was finally resolved through John F. Kennedy's diplomacy with the Soviet Union's Khrushchev. By the way, do you like this presentation style? Totally ripped it off of Stefan, sorry dude. Now that we've established what's usually taught, or at least generally known, about the Cuban Missile Crisis, let's take a deeper look and start deconstructing some of these ideas. First, the diplomatic aspect of the crisis. The Soviet Prime Minister, Nikita Khrushchev, actually sent two offers for peace during the crisis. On the 26th of October, he sent a letter to Kennedy saying that the missiles in Cuba would be removed if the US promised not to invade it. On the 27th, there was another offer that the missiles would be removed from Cuba if the US withdrew rockets from Turkey that were pointed at the Soviets. And here's where things get weird. The US missiles in Turkey that were one of the main causes of the crisis? Well, they were already deemed obsolete and slated to be withdrawn by the United States. Replacing them would be the better submarine-based Polaris missiles, which were much more dangerous. So the US was going to withdraw the missiles in Turkey anyway, and Khrushchev's two proposals to end the crisis were incredibly reasonable in retrospect. So what did Kennedy do? Did he breathe a sigh of relief and readily accept the deal? Well, no. As National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy put it, the current threat to peace is not in Turkey, it is in Cuba. Yes, the huge US missile force trained on the weaker Soviet Union isn't a threat to peace, because the US is always good while the Soviets are always bad. There was a fear of a missile gap at this time, but in reality, this gap was strongly in favor of the United States. So why were we freaking out? The Soviets had to deal with our missiles for years, why couldn't we? Well, let Kennedy explain it to you himself.
Last month I said we weren't going to. Last month I should have said that we don't care, but when I said we're not going to, and then they go ahead and do it, and then we do nothing, then I would think that our risks increase. I agree. What they got enough to blow us up now anyway. I think it's just a question. Well, this is a political struggle as much as military.
So this entire crisis wasn't even necessary and more for appearance's sake. Oh yeah, are you wondering where I got this audio? Well, it turns out JFK recorded his meetings during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they've been declassified for our viewing pleasure. I'm obviously not going to show you the whole recording because they're incredibly long, but there are a few interesting moments in the tapes. So, this tape records a meeting on Tuesday, October 16th, 1962, the day the crisis began.
This is a result of the photography taken somewhere, sir. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and two new military encampments.
Let me just skip ahead.
This is a fairly extensive airstrike. It is not just a strike against the missile sites, and there would be associated with it potential casualties of Cubans, not of U.S. citizens, but potential casualties of Cubans, at least in the hundreds, more likely in the low thousands, say 2,000 or 3,000.
Wow, he just casually mentions killing Cubans. By the way, the proposed invasion would fail because the Cubans already had nuclear weapons, which they hadn't accounted for. Anyway, sorry, let's continue.
We have other evidence. Khrushchev is honestly believes, or at least affects to believe, that we have nuclear weapons. And that combination. Kamiko part of that in this press conference. It may mean Okinawa.
Okay, this is actually quite interesting. Recently uncovered was the fact that 6 months before the crisis, the US actually had secretly deployed missiles in Okinawa that were pointed at China. So Khrushchev was right. He did have a good reason to distrust the US.
I would say that you're dropping bombs all over Cuba. You do the second. The airports, knocking out their planes, dropping it on all their missiles. You're covering most of Cuba. You're going to kill an awful lot of people, and we're going to take an awful lot of heat on it.
So, we've watched a couple clips from the tape, and I just want to point out that they mostly discuss possible responses like a limited airstrike, a larger scale airstrike, or even a full invasion of Cuba. They even just casually mention killing Cubans, like what? This clip is really the extent of the moral objection anyone has in the tapes, and it's reflexive of the discussions everywhere. Rarely does anyone morally object to killing thousands of Cubans because it's just assumed that the US is always just. So, what happened in the end? Well, the US finally agreed to remove the missiles in Turkey that, may I remind you, they were already planning to remove, but that they would do it in secret. Why? Well, as Michael Dobbs put it, if it appeared that the US was dismantling the missiles unilaterally under pressure from the Soviet Union, the NATO alliance might crack. Or, in better words, if the US replaced useless missiles with more dangerous weapons, which they were already going to do, in a deal with the Soviets that was incredibly reasonable, then the NATO alliance might crack. You can see it in the tapes themselves.
Mr. President, there's an emergency. Castro just sent us a screwdriver and told us to screw ourselves. Bad Castro, I'm gonna screw him so hard. Wait, what's that noise? Fidel Castro, are you doing the Gangnam Style?
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Oppan Gangnam Style.
Whoa, sorry there guys, I didn't mean to put the audiobook of my historical fanfiction on. No, not that historical fanfiction. Nope, not that one either. Or that one. Look, can we just continue? What about the Cubans? This is the Cuban Missile Crisis after all. Let's take a look from their perspective. Well, without a deterrent and a great lessening of Soviet forces in Cuba, the US pinky promised to probably not invade. In the aftermath of the crisis, however, Cuba wasn't left alone. On November 8th, when the Pentagon announced that all known Soviet missile bases were dismantled, a sabotage team carried out an attack on a Cuban factory, killing 400 workers. This was Operation Mongoose, Kennedy's terrorist campaign in Cuba. Even before the crisis started, the US was already initiating terrorist activities in Cuba, and it's pretty justifiable that the Soviet Union would want to place a deterrent there to stop the US from invading. This terror war against Cuba began after Kennedy's failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1959. The atmosphere in the White House was described as almost savage, and that there was a huge demand for an action program. This action program included a terrorist campaign and attempts to overthrow the government of Cuba. The legacy of this terror can still be seen today. We still have people complaining about Cuba's human rights record and saying that they're a poor country that suffers economically. Well, guess whose fault that is? The US! And I'm not pointing fingers. Eisenhower state official Lester Mallory literally said that Castro would be removed through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So every possible means should be undertaken to weaken the economic life of Cuba in order to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. The Cuban government has counted around 800 terrorist attacks in Cuba since 1960, and the total has been 3,478 dead and 2,099 injured. Voices from the Other Side is an oral history by Keith Bolender that recounts the experiences of Cubans during this terrorism, and it's an incredibly eye-opening book. One clear-cut example is the bombing of the Cubana Airlines Flight 455 in 1976 by CIA-linked terrorists, killing 73 people. Passengers at this time included a national fencing team, some Cuban fishermen, and a few North Koreans. Although the perpetrators did face prison time, the two men who arranged the bombings managed to live out in peace in Miami. The black box of the plane, which recorded its last moments, have been recovered.
We are descended immediately. We have fire on board. Giovanna 455. We are requesting immediately landing. 455, you are clear to land. La puerta, cierra la puerta. For emergency, on standby.
The US terrorist campaign in Cuba went on, with bombings in hotels, biological terrorism, the torturing of innocent fishermen, the murders of teachers, and Operation Peter Pan. I know you're wondering, what does this terrorism have to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, it has everything to do with it. Historian Thomas Patterson states, had there been no exile expedition at the Bay of Pigs, no destructive covert activities, no assassination plots, no military maneuvers and plans, and no economic and diplomatic steps to harass, isolate, and destroy the Castro government in Havana, there would not have been a Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis officially ended on October 28, 1962. The news reported that it was a humiliating defeat for the Soviets and that the US had saved the day, but really, it was Khrushchev's concessions that had saved the day. If he hadn't accepted the deal that the US would remove missiles in Turkey secretly, then the world may not be here right now. The crisis started with terrorist activities in Cuba and ended with the US rejecting a reasonable proposal from the Soviets. Terrorism in Cuba still continued for decades after the crisis. When Castro died a few years ago, all I heard were things about their human rights violations and repressiveness. Nowhere did I hear anything about the huge propaganda and terrorist campaign waged against Cuba by the US. The sad thing is that right-wingers who virtue signal and pretend to care about history being lied about don't really care about any of it. If they did, they would mention the US government's track record of lying and falsifying history. Cuba is only one country out of many that the US has terrorized. This idea of American entitlement hasn't gone away and has actively led to more nuclear close calls, making the Cuban Missile Crisis important now more than ever. So, what are we gonna do? It seems that it took a miracle to survive everything up to now, and we'll probably be bathing in nuclear fire before any sort of revolution takes place. I guess the only thing we can do is embrace positivism and hope the aliens come and save us.
We interrupt your programming. This is a national emergency. Important instructions will follow.
Whoa, what the heck is going on?
Please shut your mouth. I am trying to give a warning.
You shut your mouth, jerk. Now let me figure this out. Whoa, what the? This is boring. Wanna go play Fortnite? Crossplay is disabled for Switch and PS4. Capitalism is such a piece of shit! That joke probably would have been funnier if I'd finished the video a month earlier, but I wasn't not gonna put it in. So I'm thinking of making this into some sort of series where I delve into the truth about other historical events, you know, like Stefan Molyneux does, but good. Research and animation for these videos takes a ridiculous amount of time, so I'm really sorry it took me almost 2 months to upload this. I know I said that I would do a video on something different and possibly easier, but then I did this huge project and completely screwed up my timeline. If you want to take a look at the JFK tapes, just look at the links in the description. Most of my sources are there. In addition to recommending Voices from the Other Side, I'd also recommend Who Rules the World, which I used heavily as a source, specifically the chapter The Week the World Stood Still. I'll put a link to it in the description. And as always, no war but the class war.
Oh, I'd like to go out with you, but you don't own a house? Oh my god! Why are you even in these people's orbit to begin with? I mean, good god, if a woman said that to me, oh, I'd like to go out with you, Steph, but you don't own a house. They're like, wow, sorry, you're just too expensive a whore for me. I mean, thanks, but, you know, I don't engage in prostitution, so I'm afraid that you're going to have to find some other blind, self-hating sugar daddy to prey on. I mean, my God! How could you even continue a conversation with such a predatory witch?